The cruelest words I ever spoke were the ones I believed she would never take seriously. I still remember the sound of the crystal glass touching the marble countertop the moment everything changed. It was almost laughably ordinary. The city glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Manhattan mansion, traffic moving like rivers of white and red beneath the winter sky. My phone would not stop vibrating with messages from business partners waiting for my approval. But Emma stood quietly in the kitchen holding 2 steaming cups of coffee, as if none of that mattered. She always added a single spoonful of cinnamon to mine because she insisted life was too short for bitter mornings. I used to tease her about it. That morning I barely looked up. "You know," I said while signing another document, "I never planned to keep you forever." The words floated across the room with frightening ease. I expected silence, maybe tears, maybe another argument that would disappear before dinner. Instead, Emma simply nodded. There was no anger in her hazel eyes. No dramatica kiesaschen. No desperate attempt to make me change my mind. She placed my coffee beside my hand with the same gentle care she always had and offered a smile so calm that it unsettled me more than any scream ever could. "Thank you for finally being honest," she said softly. Then she turned and walked upstairs. I watched her disappear around the corner before returning to my paperwork. Pride has a strange way of convincing powerful men that every door they close can be opened again whenever they choose. I believed Emma loved me too much to leave. After all, where would she go? She had spent 3 years inside this enormous mansion, surrounded by luxury that most people only saw in magazines. She had access to everything money could buy. Designer clothes filled her closet. A luxury car waited in the garage. Every comfort imaginable rested beneath the same roof. I convinced myself that comfort always defeated courage. I could not have been more wrong. Nearly an hour passed before I realized the house had become unusually quiet. Emma usually hummed while watering the plants or played soft music somewhere. Upstairs. That morning there was only silence. I glanced toward the grand staircase and noticed a suitcase resting beside the front door. My first instinct was almost amused. She was trying to make a point. She wanted me to stop her. I leaned back in my chair instead. If she wanted attention, I would not reward the performance. A few minutes later she appeared wearing a simple cream-colored sweater, blue jeans, and the long camel coat she had owned before we ever met. There were no expensive handbags. No jewelry except the small silver necklace her grandmother had given her years earlier. She walked slowly toward the entrance, pulling the suitcase behind her. Winston, my golden retriever, stood beside the door wagging his tail before suddenly becoming still, sensing something neither of us wanted to admit. Emma knelt beside him, wrapped her arms around his neck, and whispered something that made his ears lower gently. Then she stood, reached into her coat pocket, and placed a small brass key on the hallway table. It was the spare key to the mansion. She did not leave it carelessly. She placed it down with quiet respect, as though returning a borrowed chapter of her life. I finally looked up from my papers. "You will be back by tonight," I said confidently. She rested one hand on the suitcase handle and met my eyes for what would become the last time inside that house. "No, Nathan," she answered with heartbreaking peace. I packed everything that mattered. Before I could respond, she opened the front door. Cold winter air rushed inside. The door closed gently behind her. There was no slam, no final argument, only the soft click of a lock that sounded far louder than it should have. I stared at the entrance for several seconds before reaching for my coffee. I took one sip, frowned at the unfamiliar taste, and realized for the first time in years that the cinnamon was missing. The first lie I told myself after she left was that silence was temporary. I walked into my office that morning exactly as I had every weekday for the past 15 years. My executive assistant handed me a leather folder filled with contracts worth millions of dollars. Investors waited for my decisions. Phones rang without interruption. Meetings stretched from one conference room to another. Everyone treated me exactly the same because nothing about my public life had changed. I still wore the expensive tailored suits. I still gave confident answers. I still signed documents with the same steady hand. By every visible measure, Nathan Walker remained completely in control. Yet sometime around noon, I reached for my phone to send Emma a message asking what she wanted for dinner, before remembering there was no reason to ask anymore. I placed the phone back on the table and continued the meeting as though nothing had happened. That evening I drove home expecting to see lights glowing warmly through the mansion windows. Instead, every room greeted me with perfect order and unbearable stillness. Winston hurried toward the entrance the moment he heard my footsteps, his tail wagging hopefully before slowing as his eyes searched behind me. He looked past my shoulder, then toward the driveway, waiting for another car that never arrived. I rubbed behind his ears, but even he seemed to understand that something had shifted inside the house. I loosened my tie, walked into the kitchen, and automatically reached for 2 coffee mugs before stopping halfway through the motion. One mug remained in the cabinet. The other rested alone beside the coffee machine. I laughed quietly at myself. It was ridiculous. She had been gone less than 24 hours. People ended relationships every day. Adults moved on. That was what I told myself while drinking another cup of coffee that tasted strangely flat. My eyes wandered toward the small wooden shelf where Emma used to keep spices. The cinnamon jar was gone. Not forgotten. Not misplaced. Gone. She had taken the one thing she actually bought herself because she always insisted the brand at the grocery store tasted better than the expensive imported version I preferred. I stared at the empty space longer than I wanted to admit. Later that night, I wandered through the mansion without any destination. Her reading blanket still rested neatly across the sofa. A pressed wildflower remained inside the novel she had been reading. One of her favorite ceramic bowls sat drying beside the sink because she had washed it before leaving. Every object seemed to whisper the same uncomfortable truth. She had not stormed out. She had prepared to leave with remarkable peace. Before going to bed, I unlocked my phone and finally opened our last conversation. The final message came from Emma nearly 3 hours after she had left the mansion. There were only 9 words. I hope one day you find what truly matters. There was no accusation, no guilt, no demand for an answer. I stared at those words until the screen slowly faded to black. For several minutes I considered replying. My fingers hovered above the keyboard before pride quietly won another battle. If I answered now, she would think I regretted what I had said. I convinced myself she needed time to calm down. Tomorrow she would probably return for something she forgot. Maybe a sweater. Maybe another suitcase. Maybe she simply needed space. That explanation sounded much easier than accepting the possibility that she had planned every step before quietly walking through that front door. I climbed into the enormous bed that suddenly felt far too large for one person. Winston refused to sleep in his usual corner that night. Instead, he lay outside the bedroom door facing the hallway, lifting his head every time the old wooden floors settled as the house cooled in the winter air. Several times I caught myself listening for familiar footsteps that never came. Around midnight, I finally drifted into restless sleep with the lamp still glowing beside me, completely unaware that while I continued waiting for Emma to return, she had already checked into a small seaside and more than 100 miles away, unpacked her suitcase, opened the window to the sound of crashing waves, and for the first time in years fallen asleep without wondering whether she was enough for the man she loved. 3 weeks were enough to teach me that a mansion could become the loneliest place in America. Every morning began exactly the same. The alarm rang at 6:30. I walked into the kitchen. I reached for 2 coffee mugs before catching myself. I opened the cabinet where the cinnamon used to sit even though I already knew the shelf was empty. Habits survived long after people disappeared. Pride did too. I still refused to call Emma. Every excuse sounded reasonable inside my own head. She wanted space. She needed time. She would eventually realize life was easier with me than without me. I repeated those thoughts so often that they almost sounded true. The world outside never slowed down. My companies continued expanding. Financial magazines praised another successful acquisition. Reporters asked about future investments, and I answered every question with the same confidence I had always displayed. Nobody noticed the growing exhaustion beneath my smile because I had spent years mastering the art of appearing untouchable. Yet every evening the performance ended the moment I stepped through the front door. Winston developed a new routine that quietly broke my heart. At exactly 5:45 every afternoon, he walked to the entrance, sat beside the glass door, and stared toward the driveway. He remained there for nearly 20 minutes before finally lying down with a disappointed sigh. He never barked. He simply waited. One rainy Thursday, I sat beside him on the hardwood floor and absent-mindedly scratched behind his ears. "She is not coming tonight," I whispered, unsure whether I was speaking to the dog or to myself. Winston rested his head against my leg without looking away from the empty driveway. The silence inside the mansion had changed. At first it felt temporary. Now it felt permanent. I wandered upstairs one evening and paused outside the small reading room Emma had created from an unused guest bedroom. I had almost forgotten the space existed because I rarely entered it. She once told me every home needed a room where people could slow down. I had laughed and called it impractical. The door creaked softly as I pushed it open. Afternoon sunlight spilled across overflowing bookshelves, comfortable chairs, and the knitted blanket she used every winter. Everything remained exactly where she had left it. A bookmark rested halfway through one of her favorite novels. A dried lavender flower still lay between its pages. On the windowsill sat a tiny potted plant, somehow continuing to grow despite weeks without attention. I stood there much longer than I intended. For the first time, I asked myself a question that should have been obvious years earlier. How many dreams had Emma quietly built inside this house while I remained too busy to notice? Meanwhile, more than 100 miles away, Emma had begun building a completely different life. She rented a small apartment above a family-owned bookstore overlooking the ocean. Every morning she opened the windows and let fresh sea air replace memories she no longer wished to carry. She spent her days helping customers discover stories, organizing children's reading circles, and learning the names of neighbors who smiled because they genuinely wanted to know her instead of wanting something from her. Nobody there cared about expensive watches or luxury cars. Nobody recognized Nathan Walker. For the first time in years, Emma introduced herself without being connected to someone else's reputation. Late one afternoon, while finishing paperwork inside my office, I received an unexpected package with no return address. Inside rested nothing except a hardcover novel I had once given Emma for her birthday. Tucked between the pages was a handwritten note in her familiar handwriting. "Stories deserve readers who appreciate them. I hope this one finally finds its way back to you." There was nothing else. No explanation. No request. No farewell. I slowly opened the book and noticed dozens of tiny pencil marks beside passages she had loved. One sentence was circled twice. I read it over and over until the words settled heavily inside my chest. The greatest tragedy is not losing someone. It is realizing too late that they had been quietly saving you all along. I closed the book without another thought for work that evening, and for the first time since Emma left, I no longer wondered when she might come back. I began wondering whether I had ever truly known the extraordinary woman who had walked beside me for 3 years. The moment I stopped searching for excuses was the moment I finally started searching for the truth. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while I wandered through rooms I had ignored for years. I told myself I was only organizing the house, but deep down I knew I was looking for pieces of Emma that she had quietly left behind. Her reading room no longer felt like an empty space. It felt like a conversation I had never bothered to finish. As I dusted one of the shelves, I noticed a small wooden box tucked behind several hardcover novels. It was plain, almost invisible, the kind of thing most people would overlook without a second glance. Inside were neatly organized envelopes, receipts, handwritten thank you cards, and a faded notebook filled with careful entries in Emma's handwriting. I sat down in her favorite chair and opened the first envelope. It contained a letter from an elementary school principal in Brooklyn thanking an anonymous donor for replacing every outdated library book before the new school year. The amount donated was far larger than I expected. I checked the attached receipt. The payment had come from Emma's personal account. Another envelope contained photographs of smiling children holding brand new backpacks during a community reading event. Another held a handwritten note from an elderly widow thanking someone named Emma for paying 6 months of utility bills after her husband passed away. There were dozens of letters. Every one of them carried the same quiet gratitude. None of them mentioned my name. I kept turning pages, feeling my heartbeat grow heavier with every discovery. Emma had never asked for recognition. She had never posted photographs online. She had never told dinner guests about the lives she had changed. She simply saw people who needed help and quietly became the answer. Then I opened the notebook. Every page listed names, birthdays, schools, local shelters, libraries, food drives, and community events. Beside each name she had written small reminders. Olivia loves mystery novels. Mr. Harris cannot climb stairs. Jacob wants to become an engineer. Mrs. Ramirez misses talking to her grandchildren. They were not donations to her. They were relationships. She remembered details because she cared enough to remember. My eyes stopped on one sentence written in the margin beside a grocery receipt. It read, "Kindness works best when nobody feels indebted." I slowly closed the notebook and leaned back in silence. I had spent years believing generosity meant writing large checks with cameras present. Emma had quietly taught an entirely different lesson without ever speaking it aloud. My phone interrupted the silence. It was my financial advisor asking whether I wished to renew membership at an exclusive charity gala. Without thinking, I asked him a simple question instead. Did Emma ever make donations through our foundation? There was a brief pause before he answered. No, sir. She always requested complete privacy and used her own account. She specifically asked that nothing be connected to your businesses because she wanted the attention to remain on the people receiving help. I thanked him and ended the call. The words lingered in the quiet room long after the screen went dark. She had protected my reputation without ever using it to elevate herself. Hundreds of miles away, Emma spent that same afternoon sitting cross-legged on the floor of the bookstore beside a circle of children listening as they took turns reading aloud. One little girl stumbled over a difficult paragraph before looking up nervously. Emma smiled with the same gentle patience I remembered from countless evenings at home. Take your time, she encouraged. Stories are not races. The best ones are meant to be enjoyed. The little girl tried again and finished with a proud grin while the other children applauded. Emma clapped the loudest. She never knew that at nearly the same moment I was sitting alone inside a mansion surrounded by proof that the woman I thought I understood had quietly spent years changing lives one person at a time. For the first time since she walked away, I did not miss her because the house felt empty. I missed her because I finally understood how empty I had been while she was standing right beside me. The day I finally left my office before sunset shocked everyone except the man I was becoming. My assistant looked up from her desk as I picked up my coat without reviewing the last stack of contracts. Waiting for my signature. "Are you feeling all right, Mr. Walker?" she asked carefully. I almost answered with the automatic confidence that had defined me for years, but the truth escaped before pride could stop it.
No, irraplia quietly.
I think I have been pretending to be all right for a very long time. I drove through Manhattan without a destination until I remembered the addresses inside Emma's notebook. The first stop was a neighborhood library in Brooklyn where she had volunteered every other Saturday. It was a modest brick building surrounded by maple trees beginning to lose their leaves. Children laughed near the entrance while parents carried stacks of borrowed books to their cars. Nothing about the place reflected the world I had spent my life building. Yet I found myself standing there longer than I expected. Inside, an elderly librarian greeted me with a warm smile. When I mentioned Emma's name, her expression immediately softened. "You must be family," she said. I hesitated before answering. I was someone important in her life. The librarian nodded gently as though she understood more than I had admitted. She led me toward a reading corner filled with colorful cushions and small wooden shelves. "Emma used to sit right there every Saturday morning," she said. She believed every child deserved one adult who listened without rushing them. My eyes followed her hand toward a simple rocking chair near the window. It looked ordinary, yet I could almost imagine Emma sitting there with a picture book resting across her knees while children gathered around her. "She never missed a weekend unless she was sick," the librarian continued. Even then, she sent books and handwritten notes. I thanked her and quietly walked outside carrying a strange weight that money could not lighten. The next address brought me to a community food pantry where volunteers sorted donated groceries into neat boxes. A middle-aged man recognized Emma's photograph the moment I showed it to him. His face brightened with genuine affection. "She never came empty-handed," he said. "Sometimes she brought canned food, sometimes blankets, sometimes she just stayed to talk with people who felt invisible. You would be surprised how much kindness can feed a hungry heart." I looked around the busy room, watching volunteers laugh while working side by side. Nobody knew who I was. Nobody cared how much I owned. For the first time in years, I experienced the unusual freedom of being judged only by my presence instead of my reputation. Before leaving, I quietly asked whether the pantry needed anything. The man smiled politely. "We always need volunteers." His answer stayed with me all afternoon because it was the first request I had heard in years that could not be solved with a check. Meanwhile, Emma had become part of the small coastal town in ways she never expected. The owner of the bookstore trusted her with every customer recommendation. Local parents greeted her by name during weekend reading circles. Elderly neighbors stopped to wave whenever she walked along the boardwalk carrying a canvas bag full of returned novels. She no longer measured her days by luxury or convenience. She measured them by conversations, laughter, and the quiet satisfaction of helping someone discover a story worth remembering. As the sun disappeared beyond the Atlantic Ocean, I parked beside the Hudson River instead of returning directly home. I opened Emma's notebook once again and noticed a sentence I had somehow overlooked before. Written neatly across the final page were only 8 simple words. "Love is proven by attention, never by possession." I stared at those words until the city lights reflected across the dark water. For years I believed providing everything someone could buy was enough. Emma had spent 3 years trying to teach me that the greatest gift was not protection, comfort, or wealth. It was showing another human being that they were fully seen. That night I returned to the mansion carrying nothing in my hands except a notebook. Yet I felt as though I had begun the most important journey of my entire life. The hardest journey I ever took began without bodyguards, without headlines, and without any guarantee that I would find what I was looking for. A week after visiting the library and the food pantry, I stopped pretending that I was only learning about Emma's past. I was searching for the woman I had failed to understand while she was standing beside me every single day. I asked no employees to investigate her. I hired no private detectives. For the first time in my life, I wanted to earn an answer instead of purchasing one. Emma had always believed people deserved privacy. If I truly respected her now, then I had to respect the life she had chosen after leaving mine. I simply followed the places that mattered to her. Every Saturday morning I volunteered at the Brooklyn Library, shelving books beside retirees, college students, and parents who gave up their weekends for children they had never met. Nobody recognized the man newspapers often described as one of the city's most powerful businessmen. I wore blue jeans, old sneakers, and a baseball cap that Emma had once convinced me to buy during a weekend street fair. One afternoon, a little boy handed me a picture book and asked if I would read it to him because his mother was helping another child. I almost declined out of habit. Then I remembered Emma's favorite sentence. "Every child deserves one adult who listens without rushing them." I sat beside him and stumbled through funny voices that made the children laugh far more than the story itself. When the reading circle ended, the librarian smiled at me with quiet approval. "Emma would have loved that," she said. Those 6 words stayed with me longer than any compliment I had ever received in a boardroom. While my world slowly changed, Emma never imagined that I was walking a similar path from hundreds of miles away. Her mornings began with sunrise over the Atlantic Ocean instead of city traffic. She unlocked the bookstore before 8 o'clock, brewed fresh coffee for the staff, and arranged handwritten recommendation cards beneath newly arrived novels. She had become the person everyone visited when they needed the perfect story for a birthday, a difficult season, or simply a quiet afternoon by the water. The bookstore owner often joked that customers trusted Emma more than bestseller lists. She laughed every time, never realizing how naturally kindness had become her greatest talent. One evening, after finishing another volunteer shift, I found myself driving north with no destination beyond the hope that the road itself might teach me something. Small towns replaced skyscrapers. Family diners replaced luxury restaurants. I stopped at a modest roadside cafe overlooking the water and ordered a slice of homemade apple pie because Emma always insisted the simplest desserts tasted the most honest. An elderly waitress poured my coffee and asked whether I was traveling for business or for family. I looked out at the waves before answering. I am traveling because I forgot what mattered. She nodded without asking another question. Sometimes people leave, she said gently. Sometimes they leave so we finally notice the parts of ourselves that needed changing. I thanked her, although she could not possibly know how deeply those words reached. Before returning to New York, I walked along the quiet boardwalk with my hands in my coat pockets, as sea wind carried the scent of salt through the evening air. Couples laughed in the distance. Children chased gulls across the sand. I realized that for the first time in decades I was not thinking about profits, negotiations, or tomorrow's meetings. I was thinking about whether I had become the kind of man who deserved another conversation with the woman I had once taken for granted. Somewhere nearby, without either of us knowing it, Emma closed the bookstore for the evening and stepped onto the same shoreline from the opposite direction, carrying a canvas bag filled with borrowed novels and a peaceful heart that no longer depended on whether I ever found my way back. Some reunions begin with an apology. Ours began with complete silence. Nearly 4 months had passed since Emma walked out of my life carrying a single suitcase and more dignity than I had deserved. During those months, I had changed in ways nobody inside my old world could fully explain. I spent weekends volunteering instead of attending exclusive dinners. I visited libraries more often than luxury hotels. I learned the names of children who loved adventure novels and elderly neighbors who simply wanted someone willing to listen. None of those choices erased my mistakes, but they slowly reshaped the man staring back at me every morning in the mirror. One Friday afternoon, the librarian in Brooklyn handed me a colorful flyer before I left. "You should visit this," she said with an encouraging smile. "It is one of the best community book festivals on the East Coast. Local bookstores, authors, reading programs, everyone comes together." I thanked her without paying much attention until my eyes settled on the list of participating bookstores. One name stopped my breathing for just a second. Harbor Light Books. It sounded familiar because Emma had once mentioned wanting to own a little bookstore near the ocean where people came for conversations instead of shopping. I folded the flyer carefully and drove there the following morning with no expectations except curiosity. The festival stretched across a charming seaside park overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. White tents lined the walking paths. Families carried canvas bags overflowing with novels. Musicians played soft acoustic songs while children laughed during outdoor storytelling sessions. The entire place felt warm in a way my former life had rarely allowed. I wandered from one booth to another until I noticed a familiar cream-colored sweater moving between shelves of newly released books. Time seemed to slow without asking permission. Emma stood only 30 feet away, helping a little boy choose his very first mystery novel. She knelt beside him with the same patient smile I remembered from countless evenings at home. After the boy hugged the book against his chest and ran back to his parents, she stood and turned toward the crowd. Our eyes met instantly. Neither of us moved. The sounds of the festival faded beneath the weight of one quiet moment that had been waiting for months to happen. She looked different. Her hair was slightly shorter. Her face carried a peaceful confidence I had never truly noticed before because I had always been too distracted by everything else. She was not surprised to see me. She simply looked thoughtful, almost as though she had imagined this possibility long ago. I slowly walked toward her, stopping several feet away because I no longer believed I had the right to stand any closer. "Hello, Emma," I said softly. She smiled with gentle warmth. "Hello, Nathan." There was no bitterness in her voice. No coldness. Only calm honesty. We stood there for several seconds before I finally spoke again. "You look happy." She glanced toward the ocean where children chased seagulls across the sand. "I am," she answered. I finally built a life that feels like my own. I nodded because those words deserved respect instead of argument. I am glad, I replied, and to my surprise I realized I truly meant it. She studied my face for a moment before asking the question I never expected. You look different too. What happened? I laughed quietly, shaking my head. I started paying attention. Her eyes softened with quiet understanding. I told her about the library, the food pantry, the reading circles, and the people who had unknowingly become my teachers. I admitted that I had spent years believing love was measured by what I could provide instead of how deeply I could listen. I did not ask her to come home. I did not ask for another chance. I simply thanked her for leaving because staying would have allowed me to remain the same man forever. Emma looked at me for a long moment before a gentle smile returned to her face. Sometimes walking away is the kindest thing one person can do for another, she whispered. Standing beneath the bright autumn sky with waves rolling quietly against the shore behind us, I realized that finding Emma again was never the greatest miracle. The greatest miracle was becoming someone capable of understanding the woman I had finally learned how to see. The greatest apology I could offer was not hidden inside carefully chosen words. It was hidden inside the life I was finally willing to live. Emma and I spent nearly an hour walking through the book festival, speaking with an ease that surprised both of us. We laughed about the little reading room she had created inside the mansion and how Winston used to steal bookmarks whenever she became too distracted by a good novel. The memories no longer felt like open wounds. They felt like chapters belonging to two people who had learned something valuable from each other. As the afternoon sun settled lower above the Atlantic Ocean, we reached a quiet wooden bench overlooking the water. I reached into the canvas bag I had been carrying all day and carefully removed a plain manila envelope. It was not expensive. It carried no elegant seal or dramatic presentation. I handed it to Emma with both hands. "This is not a gift," I said gently. "It is a promise I already kept." She looked at me with quiet curiosity before opening the envelope. Inside were legal documents establishing the Emma Collins Community Reading Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting libraries, literacy programs, and neighborhood bookstores across New York State. The first page listed every board member except me. The second page showed that the organization had already received funding large enough to operate independently for many years. The final page explained that no building, scholarship, or program would ever carry my name. Emma slowly turned each page without speaking. Finally, she looked up. "Nathan," she whispered, "why is your name almost nowhere in these papers?" I smiled because months earlier I would never have understood the answer myself. Because I finally learned that kindness is not supposed to be a performance. A cool ocean breeze carried the scent of salt through the air as she continued reading. Her eyes became brighter, not from sadness but from quiet disbelief. "You already signed everything," she said. "You cannot take this back." I nodded. That was the idea. She closed the folder carefully and rested it on her lap. For several moments neither of us spoke. Children laughed somewhere beyond the rows of festival tents while seagulls drifted above the shoreline. The entire afternoon seemed to pause around us. Emma finally turned toward me with the same gentle expression that had once welcomed me home every evening. "You really changed," she said softly. I lowered my eyes for a moment before answering. "I am still changing. I hope I never stop." She reached across the bench and lightly placed her hand over mine. It was not a romantic gesture. It was something quieter and perhaps even more meaningful. It was forgiveness offered without conditions. "I never wanted you to suffer," she said. "I only wanted you to see." I swallowed the emotion rising inside my chest. "I know that now." We sat together watching waves roll toward the shore until the sky slowly turned shades of gold and pale orange. Eventually Emma stood and adjusted the strap of her canvas bag. "The bookstore closes soon," she said with a small smile. I stood as well. Months earlier I would have begged her to return with me. I would have promised vacations, jewelry, larger houses, or anything else money could purchase. Instead I simply nodded. "Then I should not keep your readers waiting." She laughed quietly, shaking her head. "Some things really are different." Before leaving, she looked at me one last time. "Take care of yourself, Nathan." I smiled with complete honesty. "I finally know how." She walked back toward the festival, disappearing into a crowd of families carrying stacks of books and warm cups of coffee. I watched until I could no longer see her cream-colored sweater among the people. For the first time since she left the mansion, I did not feel abandoned as she walked away. I felt grateful. Loving someone had once meant holding on as tightly as possible. Now I understood that real love sometimes meant celebrating the life they had built even when it no longer revolved around you. And that lesson was worth more than everything I had spent a lifetime trying to own. 1 year later, I finally understood that the strongest people are not the ones who never lose someone they love. They are the ones who allow that loss to transform them into someone worthy of the love they once took for granted. My mornings no longer began with endless meetings or the impatient rhythm of a vibrating phone. They began with Winston waiting beside the front door, eager for our walk through the neighborhood before sunrise. The mansion itself had changed in ways every visitor noticed immediately. The reading room Emma had created remained exactly where she left it, but it was no longer a forgotten corner of the house. Every Wednesday afternoon, it welcomed children from local schools, retired teachers and volunteers who gathered to read stories, share conversations, and remind one another that kindness could become a daily habit instead of an occasional gesture. The dining room that had once hosted formal business dinners now welcomed community leaders, planning literacy programs and scholarship events. The walls had not moved, but the purpose of every room had quietly transformed. My companies continued to succeed, yet success no longer measured my life. The Emma Collins Community Reading Initiative expanded into dozens of neighborhoods, restoring aging libraries, supporting independent bookstores, and providing books for families who had never been able to afford them. I visited many of those programs without introducing myself as the founder because the truth was beautifully simple. I was not the founder. Emma had planted every meaningful seed years before I ever understood what she was growing. I had merely watered the garden she imagined long before I deserved to see it bloom. One crisp October afternoon, another invitation arrived for the annual Seaside Book Festival. This time I smiled before accepting. When I reached the familiar boardwalk, the ocean carried the same calming rhythm that had welcomed me a year earlier, but something inside me felt entirely different. I was no longer searching for forgiveness. I was simply grateful for another ordinary day. Emma stood outside Harbor Light Books arranging a display of newly released novels beneath strings of autumn decorations. She looked up, recognized me immediately, and smiled with the easy warmth shared between old friends whose hearts carried no unfinished conversations. "You made it back," she said. "I promised I would support good books," I replied with a quiet laugh. "I am trying very hard to become a man who keeps his promises." She smiled, and together we walked through the festival greeting volunteers, librarians, teachers, and children who proudly showed us the books they had chosen. Several people thanked Emma for inspiring the reading initiative. Others thanked me for supporting it. We always redirected the praise toward the volunteers because both of us had learned the same lesson from different directions. Nothing meaningful was ever built alone. As the afternoon faded into evening, we stood beside the shoreline watching the sun disappear beneath the horizon. There was no dramatic declaration waiting between us. Life had become too honest for unnecessary promises. Emma looked toward the endless water before speaking. "Do you ever wish things had happened differently?" she asked. I thought about the question for a long moment before answering. "I wish I had seen your heart sooner," I admitted. "But if I had not lost you, I might never have found the better man hiding beneath my own pride." She nodded gently. "Sometimes the ending we fear becomes the beginning we need." We stood there in peaceful silence while waves rolled onto the sand and children chased the last seagulls across the beach. I realized then that happiness was never hidden inside possession, control, or the illusion that another person belonged to me. Happiness was standing beneath an open sky with a grateful heart, celebrating the life of someone who had forever changed my own. If the story leaves behind one lesson worth remembering, let it be this. Never assume the people who quietly fill your days will always remain there tomorrow. Listen while they are still speaking. Notice the small acts of love before they become memories. Because the greatest regret is never losing someone extraordinary. The greatest regret is realizing too late that they had been teaching you how to become extraordinary yourself.